Section 23 of National Geographic Magazine, Volume 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Phil Schempf. The Alaskan Boundary Survey, Part 1. Introduction by Dr. T.C. Mendenhall. As an introduction to what Mr. McGrath and Mr. Turner will have to say to you tonight, I have been requested to say something with regard to the origin of the expedition from which they have so recently returned. Everybody present is doubtless familiar with the fact that in 1867 the United States government purchased from Russia that which was then known as Russian America and is now known as Alaska, paying for the same the sum of $7,200,000. There can be no doubt that this was a wise and profitable investment at the time, as it can readily be shown that the territory has returned to the United States in cash more than it cost, and we are just beginning to measure and to understand the real resources which will sometime in the future be available. It was perhaps not generally expected at the time, if indeed it was expected at all, that in the purchase of the territory we were also coming into possession of two or three interesting and somewhat provoking controversies. One of these is with regard to the boundary line which separates Alaska from the possessions of Great Britain in North America. This boundary line was originally defined in a treaty between Great Britain and Russia in the year 1825, and in purchasing Alaska from Russia we acquired an interest in the boundary line as defined in that treaty. Although it was doubtless thought at first that the boundary line was well and satisfactorily defined, it has since come to be generally recognized that the definition is very unsatisfactory, by reason of the fact that it was based upon the very meager information available at the time the treaty was made. I may remind you briefly that the treaty defines the line as beginning at the southernmost extremity of Prince of Wales Island, which point was supposed to lie on the parallel 54° 40' north latitude. Thence it shall ascend along the Portland Canal until the 50th parallel of north latitude is reached. From this point, in accordance with the treaty, it shall follow the line marked by the summits of the range of mountains parallel to the coast until such line meets with the 141st degree of longitude west of Greenwich. From this point it shall proceed along the 141st meridian west of Greenwich until the Arctic Ocean, or the frozen ocean, which is the term used in the treaty, is reached. In a supplementary paragraph it was agreed that all of the islands known as the Island of the Prince of Wales should belong to Russia, and hence, in virtue of our purchase, to the United States, and also that whenever the summit of the range of mountains referred to before shall be at a greater distance from the coast than 10 marine leagues, the limit of the possessions of Russia shall be formed by a line parallel to the windings of the coast and never more than 10 marine leagues from the shore. It will thus be seen that the boundary line is divided into two parts, which differ materially from each other. One of these is that line which proceeds from a point near Mount St. Elias, that is to say, the 141st meridian of longitude west from Greenwich, and runs directly north to the frozen ocean. This, being an astronomical line, can readily be located by astronomical methods, and should give rise to no controversy. That part of the line, however, which separates what is known as southeastern Alaska from the British possessions is by no means simple and easily determined. At the time the treaty was made between Russia and Great Britain, the best information available was that contained in Vancouver's map, which was, and in some respects is still, the best available representation of Bering Sea and that part of North America. It seems tolerably certain, however, at the present time that the range of mountains, which was assumed to run parallel to the coast, has no real existence, and that it is therefore necessary to fall back upon the second definition of the boundary line, that is, the line which is to run parallel to the windings of the shore and be nowhere more than 10 marine leagues from the same. Experience has shown that the longer a question concerning the location of the boundary between two great nations is left unsettled, the more difficult it becomes to decide it in a manner satisfactory to both. In a region which is sparsely settled, and where there are and can be few interests, either public or private, that conflict in any way, it is not difficult to determine a boundary line without dispute. The postponement of the question, however, may leave it undetermined until the population is greatly increased, property becomes more valuable, and mineral or other resources have been discovered, which make it important to each contending side that every foot of territory shall be contested for. A very few years after the Alaska purchase, in 1872, General Grant, then President of the United States, recognizing the difficulties attending the settlement of this question, and especially the difficulties which might arise from its further postponement, recommended in his annual message to Congress the appointment of a commission for settling the boundary line between Alaska and the possessions of Great Britain. The country being practically unsurveyed, it became necessary to consider a method for a suitable survey of the country adjacent to the boundary line in order that it might be correctly defined, and various estimates of the cost of such an operation and the length of time required for its execution were made at that time. The matter was then allowed to drop, however, and nothing further was done until nearly 15 years later, when President Cleveland again brought the subject forward by referring to it in his message to Congress. In the estimates submitted for the year 1888, an item of $100,000 was inserted by the Department of State for a preliminary survey of this boundary. No action was taken upon this item, however, but in the following year an appropriation of $20,000 was made, the survey to be conducted by the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey in accordance with plans or projects approved by the Secretary of State. In drawing up the plan for the work, it was agreed to begin the operations by the establishment of points upon the 141st meridian west of Greenwich. In order to accomplish this, it was necessary to send observers into the interior, and for this purpose, in the spring of 1889, two parties were organized to ascend the Yukon river and its branch, the Porcupine, in order to establish camps as near as possible to the 141st meridian for the purpose of making the necessary astronomical observations for the determination of its location. They were also instructed to execute such triangulation and topography as would be necessary for the identification of the locations of the observing camps, and to establish permanent monuments as nearly as may be upon the meridian line. These two parties, one to occupy a camp on the Yukon river as nearly as possible where it is intersected by the 141st meridian, and the other on the Porcupine, were directed respectively by Mr. McGrath and Mr. Turner, whose observations are summarized in the following papers. It was estimated that 1 year would be sufficient for the accomplishment of the work, and this estimate was a liberal one, provided ordinary weather conditions had prevailed in that part of the country. It was found, however, that these conditions were extremely unfavorable, especially for astronomical work, on account of the continued cloudiness, rendering observations for a long time absolutely impossible. The extreme low temperature also rendered work difficult, and this of itself would have stood in the way of an early completion of the task had it been possible to carry on the astronomical observations. It thus happened that, notwithstanding the rigor of the climate and difficulty, if not impossibility, of obtaining supplies from outside sources, these parties were obliged to remain in the interior of Alaska during 2 years. Notwithstanding the unfavorable conditions under which they existed during this time, every individual of both parties returned in good health and in good condition. Indeed, there was scarcely a case of even ordinary illness during the entire campaign, a fact which must reflect great credit upon those charged with the management of the parties. So far as we have been able to ascertain by recollections and comparisons made up to this date, the work with which Messrs. McGrath and Turner were charged has been done in a manner entirely satisfactory, and so as to reflect great credit upon these gentlemen. I am sure they have very much to tell you which is of interest in relation to their experiences in this almost unknown and unexplored region, and I will not longer stand in the way of their doing so. End of section 23.